They didn't even fire me in the office. Richard Hale, our CFO, sent a 2-line email while I was walking the warehouse floor. No meeting, no explanation, just effective immediately. What he forgot was simple. Every shipment, every supplier contract, every clearance code still ran through me. Without my certification, nothing could move. Within hours, trucks were backed up across 3 states, clients screaming for answers. They thought replacing me was easy. They never realized the system lived in my hands. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. They didn't even bother to look me in the eye. Richard Hale, our CFO, thought a 2-line email would erase 10 years of my work. Effective immediately, your position has been eliminated. Return your badge. That was it. No meeting, no conversation, no acknowledgement that I was the one who kept the supply chain moving when everyone else was asleep. I read it standing in the middle of a warehouse that was humming with forklifts, shipments, and exhausted drivers waiting for my approval to send trucks rolling. In that moment, I realized they hadn't fired me. They had fired the only person who knew how the system really worked. People like Richard believe logistics is just software, dashboards, and numbers in a spreadsheet. What they never understand is that behind every automatic approval, there's a hidden process, and I was the one who built it. My digital signature was more than a formality. It was the gatekeeper. No shipment left a dock without my clearance. No supplier was paid without my verification. They thought they were cutting costs. What they actually did was cut the one thread holding their entire operation together. I didn't shout, didn't storm into his office, didn't even reply to his email. I just closed my laptop and slipped out. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. Forklifts still beeped, shipments still loaded, phones still rang. But I knew what was coming, because without my authorization, the system would choke itself. Within hours, the first shipment would stall, and then another, until the warehouses filled like clogged arteries. By tomorrow, suppliers would be on the phone demanding answers. By the end of the week, millions would bleed out of balance sheets Richard swore he could control. He thought removing me was simple. What he never saw was that he'd just pulled the pin on his own grenade. For years, they thought of me as background noise, the person who checked boxes and sent approvals no one bothered to read. What they never realized was that those boxes weren't automatic. Not really. I had built them into the system piece by piece, tightening contracts, adding clauses, stitching together supplier agreements so everything flowed. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't earn me a stage or applause, but it made the company run. Without me, the entire network of vendors, carriers, and clients never lined up. I was the one who caught the details others missed, the mismatched invoice code that would have delayed an entire truck, the compliance tag that had to be filed to clear customs, the small but critical amendments suppliers required before honoring a deal. None of it was written down. Not in any manual, not in any training guide. It lived in my head, in my habits, in the dozens of decisions I made every single day without fanfare. Richard Hale and the board never saw the difference between me and a dashboard. To them, I was just a salary, an expense they could cut. They didn't know every supplier contract had one clause tucked neatly inside. Shipments required my certification to be released. It was my safeguard, a rule I created after nearly losing a multi-million-dollar deal years ago because a junior staffer had cleared something without proper review. Since then, every deal carried my mark, my authorization. They signed those renewals year after year, never reading the fine print, never asking why shipments always moved smoothly despite chaos everywhere else. My name wasn't just on a company ID card. It was embedded across hundreds of contracts, quietly locking the supply chain to me. Without my approval, trucks wouldn't move, suppliers wouldn't ship, and payments wouldn't trigger. In their arrogance, they thought the system could run itself. But the system was me. Removing me wasn't like cutting out a redundant part, it was like pulling the keystone from an arch. It might stand for a moment, maybe even a day, but sooner or later gravity wins, and everything crashes. Richard thought I was replaceable. He had no idea he had just deleted the very foundation keeping his empire upright. The first stall came faster than I expected. By that same afternoon, a shipment bound for Dallas hit a wall. The system flagged it, certification pending. Normally, that message lasted seconds. I'd review, click through, and the trucks would roll. But I wasn't there. The drivers sat waiting, paperwork in hand, while the warehouse manager frantically called IT to ask why the order was stuck. IT couldn't find the problem. On their screens, everything looked green. The system was waiting for my clearance code, but they didn't even know where that field lived. So the shipment sat. By evening, the Dallas order was joined by 3 more, one to Phoenix, another to Atlanta, and a 4th to Minneapolis. Each stalled with the same red flag, each costing the company penalty fees for late delivery. Warehouse floors that usually emptied by midnight stayed full, pallets stacked to the ceiling, forklifts circling like sharks with nowhere to go. By the next morning, the backlog was visible from the street. Rows of idle trucks parked bumper to bumper, drivers leaning against their rigs smoking and swearing, waiting for a green light that never came. Inside, managers yelled at IT blamed vendors, and vendors refused to budge. None of them realized it wasn't a glitch. It was design. My design. The contracts were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, holding firm until the right certifier approved them. And now, that certifier no longer existed. By day 2, the warehouses looked less like distribution centers and more like graveyards of steel and cardboard. Trucks sat locked in rows, engines idling for hours before drivers finally gave up and killed them, climbing down with their paperwork and their tempers boiling. Inside, pallets stacked higher than safety codes allowed, aisles so clogged that forklifts couldn't turn without scraping walls. Every shipment added weight to the pressure, and every hour meant another round of penalty fees. The first wave of client calls started before lunch. A manufacturer in Ohio demanded to know why its parts hadn't arrived. A retailer in Texas threatened to terminate its contract unless deliveries resumed within 24 hours. The calls rolled uphill, landing on COO Linda Perez's desk. She tried to downplay it, told them everything was under control, blamed temporary system delays. But I knew she was lying to herself. The system wasn't delayed. It was locked. And there was no bypass. Not without me. Richard Hale still acted calm in front of the board. He assured them it was working aggressively to clear the backlog. He even joked during one meeting that I was probably laughing at home, watching the circus. He wasn't wrong. I was laughing, but not because I sabotaged anything. The beauty of it all was that I didn't have to lift a finger. The collapse was built into the arrogance of people like him. People who thought signatures were just ink and compliance, just red tape. By the end of that day, over 30 shipments sat frozen across 5 states. Warehouse managers sent frantic emails begging for direction, suppliers demanded late payment penalties, and one of our biggest clients, an automaker worth millions in contracts, sent a legal notice. They weren't asking anymore. They were warning. In boardrooms, Richard still dismissed it as noise, a hiccup. But on the floor, the panic was real. Drivers slept in their cabs, food shipments spoiled in refrigerated trucks that never left the docks, and insurance carriers began flagging us as a risk. The empire Richard thought he controlled was crumbling from the ground up, and I didn't even need to watch it unfold. The collapse had only just begun. The breaking point came faster than anyone at headquarters could process. By the 5th day, the backlog wasn't just a problem, it was a disaster making headlines. News choppers circled one of our distribution centers in Indiana. filming the endless rows of stalled trucks lined up like abandoned soldiers. Local reporters interviewed furious drivers who had been waiting 3 days for clearance, eating fast food in parking lots, watching their paychecks shrink while cargo rotted in the trailers behind them. By then, over 60 shipments were flagged, certification pending. That phrase, which once only meant a 30-second pause, had turned into a death sentence for every deal the company depended on. Clients who once boasted about our on-time record were now posting angry updates on social media, naming and shaming us for failure. The hashtags trended. Investors noticed. Stock dipped 3% in a single morning, then 7% by close. Richard Hale scrambled in front of the board, calling emergency meetings, pacing with his tie loosened and his voice cracking as he swore IT had identified a solution. But there was no solution. The contracts themselves required my digital certification, and no patch or password reset could change that. I had designed it to be airtight, because once upon a time I thought I was protecting the company. Now it was protecting me by proving just how foolish they had been to erase me. On the night of December 31st, every annual vendor contract expired simultaneously. Normally, I would renew them in batches, signing them off over the course of a week, confirming every clause matched compliance. But that year, with me gone, no one renewed a thing. At midnight, the system did exactly what it was built to do. It locked. Every shipment in transit, every pending delivery, every vendor invoice froze. Not one box left a warehouse the next morning. By January 1st, headlines weren't local anymore. They were national. Major supply chain meltdown. Company X deliveries halted nationwide. Business anchors discussed it on live television. Analysts dissected what the collapse meant for retailers and manufacturers that depended on us. The number circulating was brutal. $800 million in exposure within 48 hours. On Wall Street, investors panicked. Shares plummeted further, wiping out years of gains. Partners began pulling out, quietly cutting ties before the rot spread to them. In offices across the country, employees woke up to find frantic emails in their inboxes, some threatening mass layoffs, others begging for overtime to try to salvage what couldn't be salvaged. And through it all, Richard Hale tried to hold his mask, telling staff the issues were temporary. But everyone could see it. The sweat on his collar, the silence when questions turned specific, the hollow way he said the word control. The truth was out. The company wasn't in control of anything. They had fired the one person who held the key, and now the entire machine had seized. The panic wasn't temporary. It was terminal. The boardroom looked nothing like the polished sanctuary it had been when Richard Hale strutted through it with confidence. Now it was a bunker of panic, directors hunched over papers, lawyers whispering frantically, and Richard himself sitting pale and hollow-eyed at the head of the table. He had no more jokes, no more polished reassurances. $800 million in losses had stripped the smile off his face, and the shareholders were sharpening their knives. Reports leaked of clients terminating contracts, insurance carriers refusing coverage, and regulators circling to review compliance failures. The empire he swore he could control was bleeding from every vein, and he couldn't even stop the bleeding because the wound wasn't external. It was the absence of me. Linda Perez, the COO, sat with her arms folded, refusing to defend him. Board members asked questions he couldn't answer. Who held the certification rights? Why weren't contracts renewed? How could a single firing unravel the entire supply chain? Richard stammered, but everyone in that room already knew the truth. He had underestimated me, erased me, and in doing so, erased the foundation of the company itself. He hadn't fired dead weight. He had fired the keystone, and the arch had collapsed. I didn't need to gloat or demand recognition. I simply walked away, leaving their empire chained to a signature they could never replace. No sabotage, no hacking, no secret files destroyed, just the silence of my absence. From my apartment window, I read the headlines, watched the stock tumble, and saw Richard Hale's name dragged through the mud. I felt no rage, only clarity. They fired me thinking I was nothing more than a line item. What they learned too late was that I had been the keystone all along. Without me, the system collapsed. With me gone, it stays that way. They thought erasing me would save money, but in reality, it erased the only thread keeping their empire intact. One careless decision triggered a collapse no rival could have engineered, no lawsuit could have forced, and no boardroom apology could undo. My silence became the loudest answer they ever heard. What I learned from this experience is that companies often underestimate the invisible keystones, the people who don't chase titles, who don't seek credit, but who quietly hold the system together. I wasn't flashy, but my work carried weight that arrogance never saw until it was gone. When Richard Hale fired me, he didn't just lose an employee. He ripped out the stabilizer of the entire operation. The collapse that followed wasn't sabotage, it was the natural consequence of ignoring the value of those who make things work when no one else is watching. In today's world, especially in American workplaces, many people feel unseen. They do the tedious jobs, the work others take for granted, and yet they carry the true load. The lesson here is simple, but sharp. Respect the people who quietly keep the gears turning. For yourself, remember that your worth is not defined by someone else's recognition. Your preparation, your integrity, and your quiet power can become your strongest leverage when tested. How to get started today. 1. Write down the unique processes you know that others overlook. 2. Protect your knowledge. Keep personal records of your expertise. 3. Remember your value even when others don't acknowledge it. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more stories, and pass this along. You never know who needs the reminder today.